Good morning, I hope you're all doing well. It's a beautiful, cool Sunday morning here in Oregon, and I'm heading down to Jeff's. And then Jeff and I are heading over into the Oregon countryside to see Chris. And more importantly, we're going to see Chris's beautiful Egli Vincent Black Shadow. That's a bike that's featured quite a bit in my videos over the last few years, and then more recently in the ride that we did to the coast. I think at that time I mentioned that we were hoping to go and see the bike in a bit more detail. So that's exactly what we're doing today. We're heading over to see Chris and ask him to say a few more words about this brilliant bike of his. Alright, so I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you very much for your time today to meet with Jeff and I and talk about your bike. We've seen it in quite a few of my videos, and yes. I thought, and there's been a few...
we did quite a bit of riding together, that's true.
And there's been a few comments about, oh, we'd love to see or hear a little bit more about your bike.
A little bit more goes back for me to 2002. This is my 1969 Egli Vincent. It's a Slater product. It's one of the early models that came out of his workshop right after Fritz Egli stopped producing the Egli Vincent. I was a member of the OVM, and at that time I was riding Hondas, and I got to know John Ulver. My brother that Christmas had given me Jacqueline Bickerstaff's book, Original Vincent, and I perused that and I looked at that engine, looking like a great grandfather clock. I thought, that is a beautiful engine. I don't like all the gingerbread that's on the standard Vincents. What I want to do is build myself an Egli. So I told John Ulver that I was looking for an engine and a frame. And by, John said to me, you know, there's an Egli that you could probably buy from Dave Hansen. Dave Hansen is one of the proprietors of Weinwitz Leathers. And so I went by and I took a look at the bike. And he rolled it out of the shed where it had been for 15, 20 years. He was not able to ride it, nor was I, with the equipment that was on it. So we settled on a price, and I swallowed hard and ponied up the money, and I brought it home on a trailer. And my wife was shocked that I spent that much money on an old motorcycle. We eventually got it running and discovered that it needed to have the top end rebuilt. I did that. I rearranged the seating on it. This is from the Sandy Bandit, this particular seat. Back in the day, it's designed to fit a Triumph, and the tank that was on it originally was a fiberglass tank, and it was dissolving, and so I sourced a tank from Paul Zell down in California and put it together more or less in this configuration so that I could ride it, and then I started riding it, and in the 18 years that I've had it, I've put about 50,000 miles on it. I've rebuilt it several times for one reason or another. I guess the first long trip I took was to Montana, to the North American rally that they had there in 2004, 2005. And then I got a little more ambitious and I went to Colorado. And then I went to a couple of rallies in Minnesota. In 2011 I tackled the International in New York State and got there and didn't quite get back, but it was an adventure. A good deal of the appeal of the Vincent mark is the people that are involved with it. They're solid gold, all these folks, and lots of help along the way. Robert Watson has brought me home a couple of times, which I'm thankful when things broke down, but it's been an awful lot of fun. I'm trying to figure out a little more about the history of this bike, when exactly it was produced and who has owned it. And that is somewhat of a challenge. Serial number that's stamped on the engine block says RSEV54. And I think Roger told me that he started his numbering system at 50.
Oh, goodness.
This would be
The fourth one,
the
wow.
fourth complete bike that he turned out from his shop. And that was in England. And the next documentation I have is the Shadow Lake picture there that was taken in 1978, I think, and somebody in the United States owned it at that point. And from there it got into the hands of Tim Cameron, who was a noted member of the Vancouver section, and I've got some pictures of him with the bike. From there it went to Dave Hansen, and from there it went to me.
Oh my gosh. Do you have an idea of how many Eglis they made?
Well, they're still making them. It's difficult to say. The frame for this bike was turned out in Fritz Egli's shop, and it was one of the original frames that he made. Terry Prince has taken a look at the numbers on it and authenticated that's one that came out of that shop. So after it got over to England and Roger Slater started building them, he had somebody in England, Cheney perhaps. There are several makers in England that produce frames for Eglis and still do, as a matter of fact. I think John Ulver had a new frame made for an Egli Compet.
Yes, he did.
Not long ago. So it's kind of an evolving thing. As long as you can come up with an engine, you can build an Egli, and people do. Patrick Godet made quite a number of Egli Vincents. This was one of the older ones, and
it's amazing.
Still ticking.
And just from a handling perspective, you go around corners like it's on rails. It's definitely quite a race bike, isn't it?
Well, it weighs about 100 pounds less than a standard Vincent, and I think the riding position suits me better.
And you've done, as you say, some extensive work to the engine. Jeff and I were involved when you split the cases over on Jeff's workbench.
That was the last breakdown when it came back from Montana in the trailer. And it turned out that the crank pin was worn out, and we had to split the cases and send the crank off and have Steve Hamill rebuild the crank, and the cylinder heads had to be redone. So that was quite the rebuild. It's been successful though. It behaves itself very nicely.
You just eat up the miles on this. You're a real long distance rider. You rode to Montana, didn't you? To Missoula as well. When we saw you up there, you were down in Quincy, and I think you were heading off over to Tahoe after that as well.
Not so much this year, but I do enjoy getting out on the road and doing a road trip. That's true.
Yeah.
The year we met up at that rally in Colorado, you rode to California to visit your mom.
Right.
Then you rode to the rally. Then you rode to the Bonneville Salt Flat.
Right. And there were about 3 years there where I was involved in Max Lamke's efforts with the salt liner, and I would ride to Bonneville and then maybe someplace else. In 2011, I rode to New York for the International.
Goodness. And you hang out with the guys from Canada as well, right?
We have two residences. One of them is here, and one of them's in Bellingham, Washington, where my son lives. And so I have stayed in touch with the Vancouver section quite a bit. John McDougall, one of the original members of the Vancouver section, was an excellent machinist, and he's done a lot of the work on this bike in the engineering before he died.
Yeah.
And now I've had to pony up and learn how to do more of it myself. And Robert Watson has really been a help in many ways. A critical thing about the engine when you're putting an engine together is getting the cam timing properly, because the marks on the cams don't always mean anything, and the way you really do it is you set it up with a formula and 4 dial indicators to tell you exactly what the valve train is doing. And we did that with this bike, and it has transformed it from being a hard starter. People from 10 years ago may remember me kicking and the start not going. It doesn't do that anymore. It starts right up.
Amazing.
And I'm convinced that it's engine timing. The power band is lower down. It's about 1,000 RPM lower down than it used to be. So it just takes off like a train from a stop sign. And you don't have to rev it to 3,500 or 4,000 revs to get the power out of it. Basically, I'm running electronic ignition, an alternator, and a couple of Mikuni 28 millimeter flat slide carburetors. And I would say the bike has never run better with that configuration. All the old time stuff is sitting in a box.
You also have an electric starter on it as
I
well.
do. One of Grossay's electric starters.
We'll have to hear that in a
Would you
minute.
like to see a demonstration?
I think we would love to see a demonstration
Okay.
of that.
Let's see what it'll do. So there you go.
That is awesome, Chris. Well done.
Front brake is very unusual, I guess. It was made in England, and Fontana made a 4-leading shoe front brake, and that's what you see on most specials. This one is a race brake that was made for Norton's, I believe, by a man named Robinson in England. It's called a Robinson 4-leading shoe front brake, and I've seen a couple of them for sale, posted various places. Roger Slater said he never put a Robinson front brake on his bikes because they were just a real pain in the butt to get organized. And I said, well, Roger, you put on one. And that's how you got that opinion of him, I'm sure.
But you said it was pretty grabby in the beginning, but it's
it
evened
can
out.
really throw you off, yeah. That's another thing I owe John McDougall. He had a race bike that had a Robinson front brake on it, so he knew how they were set up, and he knew that I was going to wind up in the ditch if I kept riding it the way it was, and so he reorganized that and fine-tuned the shoes, and works fine now, and I don't mess with it. I should say Glenn Bewley did the rear sets and the shift linkage and the foot pegs. He did a nice job on that, and they've held up well.
And you've got a huge Kickstarter on it. I'm assuming
Yeah,
you don't use it very often. It's just a backup.
He made that too.
Oh, did he? Really?
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Very, very nice vehicles, Chris.
Well, the beauty of them is that they get used, you know.
Yeah.
They start and run, and if you need to go somewhere, there they are.
I can't leave without asking you about your other vehicle behind this little old Vincent in the front then. So what have we got there?
This is a 1958 MG Magnette sedan. It's called a Veritone. It was one of the later ones that came out with 2 tones in the trim and the big back window. I knew this car when I was in high school. It belonged to a good friend of mine's father who was an MD in Davis. And that would have been like 1960, something like that. And he owned it for many years. It sat in his driveway for the last part of its life, and it was just basically baking in the sun and just sitting there. And I asked him, what about that? And like about 1990, something like that. And he said he was going to give it to the Goodwill. And I said, well, you better give it to me then. And I basically stripped it down and restored it, and drove it for 15 years. I put lots of miles on that. It's been many times down to California and back. And it's a daily driver.